So welcome back again for this second session where we shall be going deeper into understanding the actualization of social economic valuation of ecosystem services. So in the previous session, we were able to learn about ecosystems and the biological diversity contained within them, and also the fact that they provide a stream of goods and services, of which the continued delivery remains very essential to our economic prosperity and other aspects of our welfare. So in this lesson, we want to put all that together to bring us to an understanding of the whole concept of social economic valuation of ecosystem services. So we shall be looking at the tools basically employed for that particular process. So it's obvious that before you place a value on anything, any commodity, you have to know how much it is. Therefore, we shall be looking at the tools for both quantifying ecosystem services and tools for valuing the quantified ecosystem services. And just to point out that these are the tools that we have put together to form the Colwell model. Now, research shows that a major contributing factor to ecosystem degradation is the failure of current decision makers and society in general to recognize the social and environmental values of ecosystems in spite of the many and various services provided by these ecosystems to us as humans. So you find that these contributions are not fully recognized because they are still not yet comprehensively recorded. So what is social economic valuation of ecosystem services? We can define this as the process of trying to capture the economic values of natural capital through standard procedures whose characteristics may include theoretical soundness, such that the procedures should be based on firm scientific and economic theories. They also need to be very practical, such that they are applicable to different ecosystem settings, and they should also be robust, objective, logical, and rational. And this can be actualized by translating the ecological value into both intuitive and financial terms. And of course, this depends on the ground scenarios for each particular ecosystem in question. Now, this can be achieved through different approaches that we will get to learn during this training. But the most common approaches for the quantification of ecosystem services is the quantification of the cost of lost services due to environmental degradation. And this is generally exactly what our approach for the Colwell model has been pegged on, whereby it focuses on the cost of land and wetland degradation. Now, with that understanding, how do we measure and value ecosystem services? So remember we said ecosystem services are the flows of benefits from nature or ecosystems to humans, and they represent the actual work performed by those ecosystems. These flows are, however, sometimes hard to observe and measure, but they can be inferred from observations or measurements of changes over stocks in time, structure, and spatial patterns. Different approaches can help assess these benefits that flow from ecosystems by providing different and complementary information. So there are two main approaches that happen to be causal, and these approaches follow the general tenet that one can only value goods or services only if they know the quantity of that particular good or service. So basically the two approaches are: one, the quantitative assessment, which basically looks into the quantification of ecosystem services, and two, as we have said, monetary assessment, which basically looks into the valuation of the quantified ecosystem service. Now, in the next few slides, I will just briefly try and dissect through the different approaches for quantifying ecosystem services and the different methods for the valuation of the quantified ecosystem services. So we shall start by looking at the dynamics of ecosystem service quantification tools. So ecosystem service quantification tools can be distinguished into two broad approaches, and we have biophysical approaches and the social cultural approaches. So the biophysical methods basically measure the ecosystem services in biophysical units, and they are mainly used to represent the state of and the changes in the ecosystems and the services they provide. And basically this is done using numerical units of measurements. For example, you can say you can easily quantify the amount of carbon sequestered by a certain forest in metric tons, or even the volume of water stored in a particular lake in meters cubed, and so on and so forth. So the biophysical methods can be said to rely strongly on indicators, proxies, and biophysical models, which not only allows for the quantification of ecosystem services, but also for the assessment of the conditions of the ecosystems in terms of structure and function. So generally, three approaches can be applied in the biophysical measurement of ecosystem services in relation to the character of the measurements and how the necessary information sometimes needs to be extracted. So we have direct measurements of ecosystem services, and these are those derived from observation, monitoring surveys, or even questionnaires. For example, when one is trying to measure the total amount of grass or biomass produced by a rangeland, or for instance. So we can say that direct measurements are the most accurate way of quantifying ecosystem services. However, they require a very high amount of time, clearly, and resources to implement, and mostly appropriate when you have a small site or a very local level. We also have what we call indirect measurements of ecosystem services, and these ones provide about physical value. However, further interpretations and assumptions of data processing are needed in order for it to be used as measures of ecosystem services. Examples are, information extracted from remote sensing techniques like vegetation indices. Number three, we also have what we call ecosystem service modeling, and this is where models like the Colwed generally come in to basically simulate or represent an ecological system. So when the direct and indirect data is unavailable, other ecological and social economic data and knowledge can be used as surrogate data to estimate the provision and demand of ecosystem services. And the good thing with ecosystem service models is that the input data can be modified in order to simulate hypothetical scenarios of land management, things like land cover change, or even climate change impact, in order to predict possible impacts on the provision of ecosystem services. So that's about it for the biophysical methods of ecosystem service quantification. And on the other hand, now we have the social cultural methods, and this generally aim at assessing human preferences for ecosystem services. In this approach, the values and the perceptions of both the demand and supply of ecosystem services are commonly assessed and mapped through a wide array of methods that are based on eliciting what we can call social needs and preferences. So we have three approaches that can be applied in the social cultural measurements of ecosystem services. And these are the preference assessment, which aims at assessing values through traditional social cultural data collection techniques. For example, ecosystem service rankings, questionnaires, preference and rating assessments. We also have participatory mapping and assessment methodologies, which allow end users to utilize very basic GIS capabilities for the assessment of the spatial distribution of ecosystem services based on local knowledge, preferences, or perceptions. Lastly, we have the willingness assessments, which generally incorporates the willingness of the users to invest either time or money and this can be used as a proxy for quantifying the value of a certain ecosystem service. So this can be done by directly, asking people things like how much time they would be willing to invest to change the quantity or quality of a given ecosystem service. So in summary, what we can say is that mapping and assessment of ecosystems and their services necessarily require the linking of both biophysical mapping and social cultural methods to achieve a more holistic understanding of the values and benefits that are being provided by nature. So I don't want to get into a lot of theory, because we will get a better understanding of this ecosystem service quantification techniques once we get to interact with the tool in the coming days. So now we move on to the valuation techniques. So once the quantification of the ecosystem services has been implemented, then it becomes very necessary to value these services in monetary terms or any other terms that is deemed applicable. So there are a wide range of methods used to estimate the monetary value of natural and environmental resources, and they can be subdivided into two categories. So we have methods that link the change in an environmental or natural resource to a price, for instance, the prevailing market price that can be observed in reality. And this, in other words, can be labeled as the revealed preference. We also have methods that determine preferences directly from consumers on how they feel or perceive a certain natural resource, which in other words is called the stated preference technique, and is normally achieved by using various types of questionnaires or interviewing the people to really understand what they prefer. So you'll realize that the revealed preference method for monetary valuation can actually be directly linked to the outputs from the biophysical methods we mentioned before, of quantifying the ecosystem services, while the stated preference method can directly be linked to the social cultural methods of quantification of those ecosystem services. And we will get to understand this even deeper in the next few slides, and even as we move on with this training. So before we get into the commonly used valuation techniques, I want us to briefly go through what we call the total economic value concept, commonly known as the TEV, which is a central concept of environmental economics, and which offers a very useful framework for analysis. And the reason why I'm doing this is because a lot of the terminologies in the valuation techniques that we are going to look into will borrow a lot from the TEV concept. And just to point out that the Colwood model has been built on the TEV concept, and you'll generally have a better grip once you start running the models. But in general, the TEV is the sum of all the benefits obtained from a resource or an ecosystem, and can be distinguished into two broad categories. These are the use values, and two, the non-use values of ecosystem services. So the use values generally refers to those values that involve some interaction between the ecosystem service beneficiary, which is you and me, with this resource itself. So the use can either have a direct or indirect interaction with the user. So based on that, we can say that the use values can be distinguished as direct use values or indirect use values. So we also have what we call option values, and I'm going to explain what exactly these are. So the direct values involves the human interaction with the ecosystem itself, rather than through the services it provides. And it basically defines values obtained from a removable product in nature. It may be consumptive or extractive, such as fisheries or timber or anything that you can actually harvest from the ecosystem. It can also be non-consumptive, like the recreational benefits you get from ecosystems, the educational things value you get from ecosystems, and things like that. So on the other side, you have the indirect use values, which derives from services provided by a particular ecosystem. So these ones are mainly obtained from non-removable products in nature. This might, for example, include, things like someone appreciating nature. People, when you see people watching the sunset or, watching a waterfall, those are things that we call indirect use values. It could also be the provision of cleaner water to those downstream, the prevention of downstream flooding and diseases, and so on and so forth. We also have, as I said before, the option value in which an individual derives benefit from ensuring that ecosystem services will be available for their use in the future. Get that clearly? This is where an individual derives a benefit from ensuring that the ecosystem services will be available to them in the future. So it is basically the value placed on potential future ability to use a resource, even though it is not currently being used, and the likelihood of the future use is even low. So this generally reflects on the willingness to preserve ecosystems or preserve an option for the potential of future use. On the other hand now of the spectrum, we have the non-use values, and these are values associated with benefits derived simply from the knowledge that the ecosystem is present and is well maintained. So by definition, it is not associated with any use of that particular resource or even any tangible benefits derived from the ecosystem. For example, knowing what example can I use? Knowing or appreciating that tigers live in the wild is a value even though you may never see them. So the non-use values can be split into two basic values, where we have one, the existence value, and this is value derived simply from the satisfaction of knowing that ecosystems continue to exist, whether or not this might benefit others. We also have the bequest value, which is associated with the knowledge that ecosystems and their services will be passed on to generations or descendants to maintain the opportunity for them to enjoy these particular services and goods in the future. So generally, the TV can be said to be measured by the preferences of individuals, and this means that when goods and services are provided in actual markets, individuals express their preferences through their purchasing behavior. So in other words, the price they pay in the market is at least a lower bound indicator of how much they are actually willing to pay for the benefits they derive from consuming that particular good or service. Now, for majority of environmental resources, which are mostly not traded in actual markets, because behavioral and market prices data are usually missing. So in such cases, economic valuation methods that are specific for environmental resources will always provide several tools that may be employed to estimate the non-market or external benefits. So what these techniques have in common is that they express economic value in units of money. This has the advantage of allowing the non-market benefits of ecosystem goods and services to be compared with the financial gains from their use. So now, what are the common ecosystem valuation tools and techniques? In this, I will briefly define the commonly used valuation techniques, and I'll only talk about what we have incorporated in the Colwood tool, in as much as we have provided more resources on some of the other valuation tools and techniques. So the first one is the contingent valuation method, also known as the willingness to pay. And this is a stated preference technique and aims at measuring the willingness of individuals to pay for environmental services, or the willingness to accept compensation for a foregone benefit or an incurred cost. So this method happens to be the most advanced and the most used technique for environmental valuation. We also have the market prices valuation method. This is very straightforward, and it looks into the local market prices in combination with the quantified or harvestable goods or production quantities. For example, you can talk about the number of fish, the tonnage of crop produced, the tonnage of wood, and so on and so forth. We also have the travel cost method, which applies the concept that part of economic behavior can be measured implicitly by looking at how individuals spend their money and time. So the travel cost method aims at measuring travel costs. For example, to visit a protected natural area, when someone wants to visit a park, you know, a wetland, and any recreational area. And the economic value of time, that is sometimes the associated economic spin-off. So this method is based on actual behavior. That is what people actually do, rather than stated willingness to pay or what people say they will do in a hypothetical situation. So we also have cost-based methods, and these are estimates of the values of ecosystem services that are generated by looking at the costs incurred when the ecosystem services are degraded or lost. So we have two cost methods that are very common and that we have incorporated in the Colwell model. So we have one which is the replacement cost method, which basically estimates the costs of providing the service through alternative means. So for example, if you consider a wetland that is used for purifying water, and then it happens that it can no longer function due to degradation, then the costs incurred in the construction of a conventional water treatment in place of the wetland can be equated to be the value of that particular wetland in question. So we have also the avoided damage cost, and on the other hand, which generally estimates values of ecosystem services based on the costs of avoiding damages due to lost services. So this method assumes that the cost of avoiding damages provide useful estimates of the value of these ecosystem services. So this is based on the assumption that if people incur costs to avoid damages, you know, like an insurance cost you pay to avoid a particular damage caused by lost ecosystem services, then those services must be worth at least what people paid to avoid that particular damage. So this method uses either the value of property protected. So if you have insured a car, that particular value can be equated to the value of the particular ecosystem services that is protecting you from that particular damage. If you've insured your house, and so on and so forth. This can also be looked at as the cost of actions taken to avoid the damages, as a measure of the benefits that the ecosystem provides to you. A very good example is what happens along the coast, where you have mangroves acting as anchors or protectors from storm surges and such hazards from the sea. So if that particular ecosystem or that particular mangrove wasn't there, for instance, people would have to pay more to insurance companies to protect or to cover them from any unavoidable hazards that may occur. But when you find an ecosystem like the mangroves covering that particular settlement or that particular house or that particular property, the premiums will be very low. So that is where the avoided damage cost comes in. So now here I want to in summary just show a typical spatial-based approach to ecosystem accounting or social economic valuation of ecosystem services, which generally summarizes all that we have talked about in this lesson, and which basically is the approach that the Colwell tool has been developed around. So the first step to valuing ecosystem services is the delineation of the ecosystem services or the assets. And this is where the information on the total area of the different types of ecosystem assets and characteristics is done. So you will realize that each ecosystem service has a range of unique ecosystem characteristics, which may include things like land cover, biodiversity, soil types, elevation and slope, climate, name them, and so on and so forth, all of which describe the location and functions of that particular ecosystem. So this step will also involve the compilation of the ecosystem conditions or state of an ecosystem, which includes trends in ecosystem degradation or enhancement over time. So land use land cover mapping and land use land cover change detection is normally applied to monitor the ecosystem condition over time and space. The next step is the ecosystem service quantification, where the biophysical mapping is done as an essential step in the quantification of ecosystem services. So as we said before, this involves the measurement of ecosystem services and assets in physical terms or quantities. And remember, we said this involves a consideration for each ecosystem service and the establishment of the relevant and appropriate indicators for their respective quantification. So understanding the mappable components of the individual ecosystem services is very key while choosing appropriate indicators that can be used for the quantification of the respective ecosystem services and also further valuation of the particular ecosystem services. The next step is now the valuation of the ecosystem service, which generally involves the valuation of the quantified ecosystem service in monetary terms or any other terms that may be applicable using the methods that we have already talked about. So generally, the value of the ecosystem service for each indicator will be calculated by simple arithmetics, where the biophysical indicators are multiplied by the economic indicators. So the formula is there that you can see on the screen, where ESV generally means the ecosystem service value, S is the biophysical indicator, and E is the economic indicator value. So the two are multiplied to give you the ecosystem value for that particular ecosystem service. So before we finish this lesson, let me just quickly talk about the merits of monetary valuations of ecosystem services. So the first thing that is very obvious is that it makes the business case for conserving natural ecosystems or natural capital. And this is because it gives very strong evidence on the need for conservation. Once you know the value of a particular ecosystem, you can easily, lobby for money to conserve it. It also provides a common decision-making unit, whereby it allows for comparisons between different sectors. It also provides financial costs of different management and policy options through scenario building. It also allows for comparison of different benefits of ecosystem services using the same unit. And finally, it provides a very clear picture on the cost of degradation or loss of ecosystem services. So this brings us to the end of this lesson, and looking forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Thank you.